Welcome back for talk number 2. This time around, we have Marie Manandise, hailing from Belgium, where she lives with her husband and children, and where she works as a senior web developer at Studio 24.
You may have heard Marie's name recently in connection with Studio 24's work with the W3C. She is the CMS lead on that project and was tasked with evaluating and recommending a CMS for the W3C's new website. Accessibility was a leading value in that work, and Marie has graciously joined us to share her thoughts and learnings about the challenge of implementing and improving accessibility in CMS and authoring tools.
As before, you can join the conversation via our Discord chat in the Q&A channel or by hopping into our Zoom room. The links for those are here on the watch page. Without further ado, here's Marie.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marie Manandise, and I'm a senior developer at a digital agency called Studio 24. We're based in Cambridge in the UK. Today, I'd like to talk to you about accessibility of content management systems and ask the question, what is stopping us? There is a background story to this talk that I'd like to run you through. So in February 2020, Studio 24 was awarded the contract to redesign the W3C website. So in case you've been developing websites on another planet for the past 40 years, the W3C, or World Wide Web Consortium, is an international community where member organizations, full-time staff, and the public work together to develop web standards. Basically, the people who tell us everything we can do as developers on the internet, how to write HTML, CSS, XML, everything. My job as part of this project was to select a CMS to power the redesigned W3C website. I won't enter into the details of the selection process itself because we are working in the open, so you can find everything on the w3c.studio24.net website. All our conclusion, reasoning, and thought processes are reported there. And just so you know, we chose Craft as the CMS for the W3C website. Now, working with the W3C is pretty intimidating to start with because basically the people who tell you what to do in your job, when they give a piece of feedback, you tend to listen to it. The list of requirements for the CMS was about a mile long. You had the usual one for that you'd expect for big websites. So it needs to deal well with multilingual content. You need to keep an eye on performance because the number of entries eventually is going to be like in the range of hundreds, thousands, or millions of pages. And then you've got the not so usual ones like longevity. W3C said they didn't want to change platforms before 10 years or so. They've got various systems to pull content from eventually. So the task is a bit intimidating to start with. We knew straight off the bat that we would need to somehow negotiate and compromise on these requirements. But the one requirement that really, really gave us a hard time was accessibility of the CMS. And I insist on of the CMS, so as in accessibility of the editing experience and not of the markup produced by the CMS. Because oftentimes when you look at assessments of CMS, accessibility assessments, it's all about whether the CMS helps you produce accessible markup. But that's not relevant here, that's on us. We write bespoke websites and we will write the HTML and CSS from scratch. And we did commit to make it comply with accessibility guidelines up to AA standards and sometimes in some places to AAA standards. Now, in terms of the CMS, the requirement was to find a CMS that meets authoring tools accessibility guidelines or ATAG to AA standards. And this is what happened. We basically didn't find any. We heard about one, Jeju. Unfortunately, it's very niche, very much proprietary. We couldn't even download a demo of it. We needed to go through their sales rep. So not the business model that was appropriate for us to work with. Also, you have to remember that accessibility was not the only factor. There's other important aspects that could be deemed deal breaking. So, for example, development process, maintainability. So briefly, in the end, we chose to work with Craft. We had shortlisted Craft and Statamic earlier on the basis of the features and, as I said again, the development process. And Craft really stood out because of their commitment to accessibility. So they had already committed to make Craft 4, due to be released in April or May, AA, complying with ATAG's AA standards, and they also agreed somehow to prioritize blocking accessibility issues if we reported them for the W3C, and they even pushed their accessibility agenda forward on the basis of our discussion in these circumstances, and they hired an in-house accessibility expert to guide them along the way and help them in that journey. So yes, that was a big factor to choose Craft. Now, that is a neatly packaged summary of the situation, but trust me, it was not as straightforward. And to be perfectly transparent, it was an arduous journey. It made me lose some sleep, probably shortened my lifespan a little bit. But all in all, it was very interesting because it put us in a very unique situation. In order to solve these problems, we had to do quite a bit of research, look at accessibility statements from CMS developers, accessibility initiatives, asking accessibility experts' opinions, and most of all, we talked directly to CMS developers. So we had a chat with the CEO of Statamic, with the team at Craft. Simon, our agency director, went to a networking event where he met a group of CMS developers and talked about it. So it gave us a pretty unique perspective on accessibility of CMSs. Now, there's something that struck me when looking for an accessible CMS. There was a bit of a paradox surrounding it. No matter who we talk to, no matter what we read about accessibility and accessibility statements, the unanimous message was, we care very, very much about accessibility. And yet, none of the CMSs were accessible, except for one. So I found that intriguing, and setting aside any judgment or, staying clear of lecturing anyone, because honestly, I consider myself part of the problem here. I'd like to explore and understand why that is, and why, despite our good intentions regarding accessibility, we're still not developing accessible software. In passing, just another thing that I realized while doing this work is that not only users of assistive technologies struggle to access web content, but on top of that, they do not have the tools to express themselves on the web. Web, which is a place like for everyone, universal, inclusive, well, not so inclusive if people who need that extra help don't have access to the tools for talking on that medium. So I think it's not just nice to solve that problem. I think it's a decent thing to do. So let's explore why we've got that paradox of people caring about accessibility, but CMS is not being accessible. What could explain that gap? The first explanation is that accessibility is really, really hard. It's we keep underestimating how hard and how much knowledge goes into properly doing accessibility. It's hard to understand the resources to understand the recommendations are frankly a bit dry. The language, it almost sounds abstract. So it's not. It's about how you write markup and proper rules, but it seems disconnected from the practice. It's difficult to read, it's difficult to understand. It's also very, very hard to assess the level of accessibility of a website or a piece of software. So for example, if you want to check whether your website, your navigation is accessible to a non-sighted user who uses a screen reader, you need to do paired testing. So you need an on-sighted user and a sighted user side by side in front of the screen. the non-sighted user will use the keyboard and screen reader to tab through the links. And if one of the links is not accessible, it could be skipped altogether by the screen readers. So the non-sighted user might not be aware at all that there was anything there. So they need a sighted user next to them to say, you skipped the settings tab there. Did you realize that? So that's two people. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of time, and you'd have to do all that every time you make amends to the website. So it is hard work. Someone pointed out this thread on Twitter by Kyle Simpson from Getify. Is a front-end dev and trainer, and he's saying here, seriously, in my opinion, no other aspect of front-end development seems even remotely as complex and nuanced as accessibility, nor as likely to make me feel like I'm shit at this. Someone with a lot of experience just coming to the conclusion that, accessibility is hard work. Most of us are frankly clueless about accessibility. So something that occurred to me during this whole process that I did not expect this result at all. My fellow developers at Studio 24 did not expect that, except Carlos, our accessibility expert, who had a clear told you so moment. Our points of contact at W3C did not expect that either, because not everyone at W3C is an accessibility expert either. So we did not expect that hardly any CMS would be compliant with authoring tool accessibility guidelines. We did not expect that there would be so much work to do to make these tools accessible. We did not expect that it would be so hard to even get that information about how accessible each of these CMSs was. The developers of CMSs themselves are not always clear on how compliant their software is because they haven't made the assessment and don't have the knowledge often to make that assessment. Personally, I don't remember that accessibility was a big chunk of my course in web development at all. I'm mostly self-taught, as most of us are as well, but I don't know, there was not much mentioned about it. I did a quick check on Coursera. I searched for web development courses and looked at the most relevant 20 entries. So the ones that really teach you to build a whole website, not just not just JavaScript or something, just build a website basically. Only 3 of them out of 20 even just mentioned accessibility on the introduction, the front page describing the course, which is not a lot. We're so clueless that we sometimes don't even know what are the right tools or how to plan for accessibility. We paint ourselves in corners. So for example, in theory, a well-formed HTML document that follows all the semantic rules is accessible. I mean, there's a bit more to that, but it's accessible enough. So that's as long as you respect the rules of semantics strictly. But the issue often arises when you add layers of JavaScript. And for example, if JavaScript updates the markup on the page, well, you need to tell screen readers that that area of the page is going to be updated and is subject to change. You can also get away with non-semantic markup with JavaScript. For example, you can replace a proper submit button by an n-click or a span, sorry. Anything that has a click event on it can be dealt with JavaScript to send out a form. So it's very easy to slip away from accessible patterns and proper semantic using JavaScript. So that's one thing. We just don't know enough about accessibility. Another thing that I realized is that when you look at accessibility groups that are budding in all the CMS organizations, is that they seem to be operating mostly in the margins. It's not clear how their work falls into the main development work and how much influence they have on the main roadmap. And sometimes, even when they get a word edgeweight and CMS accessibility is improved, it's then botched at the following release cycle by the main developers. So much for pushing for accessibility. I don't know about you, but I get the feeling there's a bit of a PR or image issue with accessibility experts. So they don't quite have the aura of, say, the security expert, the mythical hacker or the performance guru. we don't hear about accessibility gurus or accessibility ninjas. It's more like people telling us that we did things wrong. So there's something to readjust there. So maybe a mind shift and a PR exercise for the accessibility community. And one big factor that was put out by most of the CMS developers we talked to is there is no demand for accessibility. It's hardly ever requested. Now, does that mean there's no need for it? I don't think so. I think we might just be not very good at identifying what our needs are. Because look at all companies and institutions who put inclusivity as part of their values. It's estimated that about 20% of the population of online users have some form of disability. 20% of people, that's a large group of people. If you want to employ them and be inclusive, you need to give them the right tools. Just as you would add an elevator and a ramp to your stairs for wheelchair users, your marketing department, if they want to employ people who are non-sighted or have other difficulties, you need to provide them with an accessible CMS. So I think the need is there. We just need to be aware of it. Now, this lack of demand combined with the balancing act that is running a business or an open source initiative, because in either way, you've got to make a user base, to keep your user base happy. And the fact that accessibility is hard means that accessibility keeps being pushed down the list of priorities and sometimes forgotten about altogether. So now that we've explored the potential causes of that gap between our intentions and the practice in terms of accessibility, let's try and provide a few solutions to these issues. Now, the good thing about a situation that is very, very, very bad, like this one, is that there's something for everyone to do. So let's look at these issues one by one. Accessibility is hard. We can't change that. The rules are the rules and they're going to remain the same. But what we would need, what would help, is more accessible materials for developers to fully understand accessibility and to make accessibility assessments. So it might be a good time for the accessibility community to work on simplifying their language or having a translated spec in plain English or plain English. Could we please get accessible code patterns with use cases and code examples that we can copy, paste and tweak to fit our precise requirement? I've heard from speaking to Hidde de Vries, who is a member of the Web Accessibility Initiative, that they've got things in the pipeline to, as he coined it, make accessibility more accessible, because that's pretty paradoxical as well. Because at the moment, really only full-time accessibility experts have enough of a good level of accessibility to do anything about it. Most of us are clueless about accessibility. Well, there's a lot to be done here. If you're a student, so even if you're just starting and you're attending a course or a boot camp, ask whether accessibility is on the curriculum. If it's not, ask for it to be added to the list of modules. If enough people ask about it repeatedly, if students start to preferentially sign up to courses that do cover accessibility, that might be enough for cross-provider to think about including it in the curriculum. And of course, if you're a teacher or trainer, how much do you mention about accessibility? Yeah, are you covering the subject and can you do a bit more? If you're a developer of a new technology, like I'm thinking new frameworks, new libraries, have you thought maybe of documenting patterns to follow to produce accessible software using your tool, or documenting any potential pitfalls in terms of accessibility? That's a nice to have, okay? I wouldn't say it's as essential as, for example, having good tutorials about accessibility, but that would be nice. That would prevent us from getting into bad habits. Talking about tech stacks, and when CMS developers choose their tools, accessibility really starts when you plan your application, when you choose what languages you're going to use to build them. It's much easier not to make an accessibility mess than to retrofitting software to be accessible. It's also best not to spoil accessibility fixes every time you release or you amend the software and you release new features. So in other words, you need to bake accessibility into the development and the design process. And that ties in with the fact that accessibility groups often operate in the margins. The thing to do, or what I would suggest to do, is to first get all developers up to speed with a minimum level of accessibility awareness and knowledge, and then use your experts, your accessibility experts, as educators and consultants in-house on a continuous basis, and give them a prominent voice when you're setting up the roadmap, when you're planning the application, its architecture. And if this requires slowing down, slow down. I'll come back to that later, because I could probably do a whole talk about that. Wish for everything to slow down in the industry. But first, let's go back to like the image issue we have around accessibility experts. I think the solution to that is not complicated. If all of us tried, even for one day, to try and make one pattern of our applications to be accessible, will have systematically and automatically more respect for accessibility experts, because we'll be faced with the actual rules they got their head round, and all that knowledge that goes into it. Slow down. Everything is fine. There's no rush. When you look at the features that we're including now into the main CMSs, we're not in the fundamentals anymore. We're really in the realm of nice to haves and optimization. I don't quite understand why we value so much competition and disruption in the tech industry. When you think about it, disruption is like shock break. It's all a bit aggressive. I think we are a bit too quick as well to adopt new technologies and frameworks. There is a place for experimental, there is a place for bleeding edge, but I think there's a tendency to push new trendy tech in all kinds of places where it's not really suited. If I take my personal experience, I've learned React a few years ago. I spent a few weeks in tutorials, then gave myself the task of building a widget and did it. And then I waited for the right project to turn up for using React. And I'm still waiting. In my job, I'm not saying this is the case for you, but in my job so far, I haven't seen a use case where React was the right tool to use. Okay. And the fact is, as we keep rushing forward, we are leaving people behind. And the concept of this talk, well, it's the fact that we're so quick to rush to develop something and then rush to the next thing that we don't take the time to finish the job and to get the foundations right, even including making it accessible for users of assistive technologies. There's loads of other people that are impacted by that attitude. I don't have time to get into it. I'll just leave it there for you. Then finally, I think the most important hurdle to making software accessible is the fact that there's that feeling there's no demand for accessibility. And that's what we have the most power, is as consumer of CMSs. Think about it. If you work as a dev in an agency, you are the ones defining the requirements really when choosing the CMS. You're the one who can sell accessibility to the end client. So we need to shift a little bit to factoring accessible of the editing tools when we build our websites. We need to make that explicit when we talk to the client. We need to mention accessibility when we make feature requests to CMS developers. There is enough demand, it will get done, but we need to give it time. So it would only work if we accept that accessibility is a lot of work and that it will require to compromise on potentially on other sexy features. So for example, before we request the latest fancy trendy tech to be integrated into our favorite CMS, how about we ask ourselves, well, how much of a pain is it to make that accessible? Will a dev ever get around to making it accessible? Similarly, we should be ready to take for an answer, sorry, we're not going to look at that feature request because it will impact accessibility, or the cost of making it accessible is too high. And by the time we make it accessible, we'd have to move on to the next things. We don't think it's worth it. Because I think at the moment, CMS developers are pretty wary of giving access, or they didn't even think about giving accessibility as a reason to push back on some feature requests. So there you go. Thank you very much for listening to me, mostly ranting about accessibility. These were my 2 cents. A lot of what I said here has been said before by accessibility experts, and I need to apologize to them because it's a bit sad that it took me over 10 years of experience in this particular ordeal with choosing a CMS for W3C for the penny to drop. And now what I would like, so as I said, I'm not here to give lectures or, these are just suggestions and ideas of one person, but I want it to be a conversation opener. I wanted to relay my somewhat unique experience here to start a conversation from dev to dev and with the accessibility experts. So please do give your feedback, your opinion, whether some things I said were realistic or not. And I'll ask you to be frank, honest, and open about it. I suspect there's a bit of a taboo around accessibility because anything related to disability is a bit taboo. You don't want to be the one to be heard saying, oh, accessibility is a pain, why should I care? But then as long as we keep that for ourselves, we're not confronting these difficulties, and we're not defining the problems. As a problem solver that you are as a dev, that if you don't define a problem fully, you're not going to get the problem sorted. So there you go. Thank you very much, and over to you guys.